This is it. This is Thanksgiving dinner. Specialist Ryan Torres stared at the metal tray in front of him. A scoop of plain white rice, a ladle of canned beans, still holding the cylindrical shape of the can they'd come from. No turkey, no stuffing, no pie. Just carbohydrates and disappointment, served in a mess hall 6,000 miles from home. In the corner of the kitchen, an old man in a faded army jacket was studying the supply shelves with an expression that looked almost like hope. If you believe that magic can happen in the most unlikely places, type "feast" in the comments before we continue. Forward operating base. Reckon sat in a valley that maps forgot existed. The location was classified, the mission was classified, and the supply chain was a logistical nightmare that broke down more often than it functioned. 43 soldiers called this place home, at least temporarily, running operations that would never make the news and enduring conditions that would have made their families weep. The base had been promised a Thanksgiving resupply: turkey, ham, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. All the comforts that reminded American soldiers they were still American, even when surrounded by mountains that wanted them dead. The supply truck had left the main depot 3 days ago. It had not arrived. Somewhere on a road that barely deserved the name, the truck had thrown a rod, stranding 2 tons of holiday provisions in a location that would take at least 4 days to reach by the recovery team. The news had reached F.O.B. Brecken that morning, delivered by a satellite phone call that Colonel Sandra Mitchell had received with the stoic acceptance of a commander who had learned that the universe enjoyed disappointing soldiers on holidays. "We make do with what we have," Mitchell had announced at the morning briefing. "The mess staff will prepare the best meal possible from existing supplies. I expect everyone to maintain perspective. We're alive. We're together. That's more than some people get." The speech was reasonable. The speech was correct. The speech did absolutely nothing to lift the spirits of 43 soldiers who had been looking forward to their one taste of home in a deployment that had already stretched 2 months past its original end date. Morale, already fragile, cracked audibly. The mess hall that evening was the quietest it had ever been. Soldiers shuffled through the line, accepting their rice and beans with the dead-eyed resignation of people who had stopped expecting good things. Some ate mechanically. Others pushed food around their trays without actually consuming it. A few sat in silence, staring at nothing, lost in memories of Thanksgivings past that felt like they belonged to different people entirely. Bill Carver sat alone at a corner table, his tray untouched. At 68, he was by far the oldest person on the base, a civilian logistics consultant who had been embedded with the unit to help unfuck their supply chain problems. He'd spent 40 years in military logistics, starting as an enlisted cook and working his way through a career that had taken him to every continent and most active conflict zones. He was supposed to have retired 5 years ago. He kept not retiring because the work kept needing to be done and because home had become an abstract concept that held less appeal than usefulness. He studied his rice and beans with professional assessment. Then he stood, picked up his tray, and walked toward the kitchen. Sergeant First Class Diana Okonkwo, the senior mess NCO, intercepted him before he reached the door. "Sir, the kitchen is restricted to authorized personnel. I can't let civilians back there." Bill nodded, accepting the regulation. "I understand, but I'd like to offer my assistance. I have some experience in food service." Okonkwo's expression mixed skepticism with exhaustion. "Sir, with respect, we've done everything we can with what we have. There's no magic trick that's going to turn rice and beans into Thanksgiving dinner." "Maybe not Thanksgiving dinner." Bill's voice was calm, carrying none of the desperation that filled the mess hall. "But something better than what's on these trays. Something that might remind people they're worth feeding well, even when supplies are short." Okonkwo hesitated. She'd been in the army long enough to recognize when someone was just talking and when someone actually knew something. The old man's eyes had a quality she couldn't quite name. Confidence, maybe, or experience so deep it had become invisible. What kind of food service experience? Bill smiled slightly. The kind that involved feeding people who expected perfection and accepting nothing less. May I see your supply inventory? All of it, including whatever you've written off as unusable. Against her better judgment, Okonkwo led him into the kitchen. The space was standard military issue. Industrial equipment, fluorescent lighting, surfaces designed for sanitation rather than inspiration. 3 junior cooks stood at their stations, doing nothing because there was nothing to do. Rice was already cooked. Beans were already heated. The meal was already a failure. Bill ignored them all, moving directly to the supply shelves. He opened cabinets, checked containers, sniffed packages that had been pushed to the back and forgotten. He found a jar of peanut butter past its prime but not yet rancid. A bag of dried chili flakes that someone had brought from home and abandoned. 3 cans of coconut milk left over from a recipe that had never been attempted. A bottle of fish sauce that had been mislabeled as soy sauce and subsequently ignored. Powdered ginger, turmeric, a sad collection of dried herbs that had been sitting so long they'd faded from green to gray. And in the walk-in cooler, pushed behind boxes of frozen vegetables, a case of chicken thighs that had been marked for disposal due to a freezer burn that covered maybe 15% of the surface. "This chicken," Bill said. "When was it scheduled to be thrown out?" "Tomorrow," Okonkwo replied. "Regulations say we can't serve meat with visible freezer damage. Regulations say you can't serve it as a primary protein." Bill was already pulling the case out of the cooler. They don't say anything about using it as a flavoring agent in a rice-based dish. He moved through the kitchen with an authority that silenced objections before they could form. The junior cooks found themselves drafted into an operation they didn't understand, following instructions that made no sense until suddenly they did. Bill had them trim the freezer burn from the chicken thighs, then cube what remained into pieces, no larger than a thumbnail. He heated oil in the largest pot available, adding the chicken pieces with a handful of the dried chili flakes. The sizzle that filled the kitchen was the first appetizing sound the mess hall had heard all day. The secret to cooking with limited supplies, Bill explained as he worked, is understanding that flavor is a language. Every ingredient speaks. Your job is to make them speak to each other. He added the fish sauce. Just a splash, watching the meat caramelize. This isn't fine dining. This is prison cooking, field cooking, survival cooking. You take what you have and you make it lie to people's mouths. You make them taste things that aren't there by layering the things that are. The coconut milk went in next, transforming the pot into something that smelled like a memory of somewhere tropical. The ginger and turmeric followed, turning the liquid gold. Bill tasted, adjusted, tasted again. Then he did something that made Okonkwo's eyes widen. He pulled out the jar of peanut butter. "Sir, you can't put peanut butter in." "Watch me." He added 3 generous spoonfuls, stirring until the sauce transformed into something rich and complex, a flavor profile that suggested hours of cooking in a fraction of the time. Southeast Asian technique. Peanuts add body, protein, and a sweetness that balances the heat. The fish sauce provides umami. The coconut milk provides fat. The spices provide depth. And the chicken provides the illusion that this is a real meal instead of desperation with seasoning. He turned to the massive pot of plain rice that sat waiting to be served. Now we build layers. The next hour was a masterclass in culinary improvisation. Bill divided the rice into portions, flavoring each differently. One batch received the peanut coconut chicken sauce, transformed into something that resembled a Thai-inspired curry. Another batch was mixed with the canned beans, but not before Bill had sautéed onion powder and garlic salt in oil and combined it with the beans to create something approaching refried beans, which he then layered with rice and a drizzle of the remaining sauce to create a fusion dish that defied categorization. The dried herbs, worthless on their own, were bloomed in hot oil, until they released what little flavor remained, then folded into a third rice preparation with the remaining chicken pieces. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't traditional. But when Bill finally ladled a test portion and handed it to Okonkwo, her face went through a transformation that made the junior cooks lean forward in anticipation. She closed her eyes. She chewed slowly. When she opened her eyes again, they were wet. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "It's the same ingredients. It's literally the same rice and beans we were going to serve. How does it taste like this?" Bill was already plating, working with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Because food isn't about ingredients. Food is about intention. You are serving nutrition. I'm serving a message. The message is, you matter. You're worth the effort. Someone cares enough to make this moment better than it has to be. He arranged the different preparations on serving platters, creating visual contrast that made the humble ingredients look intentional rather than desperate. "Now, let's feed some soldiers." Word spread through the base with the speed that only soldier gossip can achieve. By the time the mess hall reopened, every member of FOB Reckon was in line, drawn by rumors that something impossible was happening in the kitchen. Soldiers who had been listless and depressed stood straighter, pulled forward by scents that triggered memories of meals they'd loved in places far from here. Colonel Mitchell arrived as the first soldiers were sitting down with their transformed meals. She watched a specialist take his first bite, watched his face shift from skepticism to confusion to something that looked like joy. She watched a staff sergeant close her eyes and chew slowly, savoring flavors that had no business existing in this place. She watched her command, which had been crumbling under the weight of delayed deployments and broken promises, begin to rebuild itself one bite at a time. She found Bill in the kitchen, supervising the plating with the quiet intensity of a conductor leading an orchestra. "Mr. Carver." Her voice carried the authority of command mixed with genuine bewilderment. "What exactly is happening in my mess hall?" Bill didn't stop working. "Thanksgiving, ma'am. Just a different kind. This isn't possible. I reviewed our supply inventory this morning. We had nothing. Rice and beans. That's all. You had nothing that looked like Thanksgiving. You had plenty that could become something worth being thankful for. There's a difference." Mitchell studied the old man with new attention. She'd barely noticed him during his 2 weeks on base, filing him mentally under civilian consultant, logistics, not relevant to operations. Now she was seeing something else. The way his hands moved with absolute precision. The way his eyes tracked every plate leaving the kitchen. The way the mess staff, who had been going through motions for months, were suddenly working with purpose and pride. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Bill finally paused, meeting her eyes. "I started in the Navy as a mess specialist, worked my way up through various assignments, ended up at the White House Navy Mess in 1987, stayed for 12 years. Mitchell's expression froze. The White House Navy Mess. The unit responsible for feeding the President of the United States and his guests, the most prestigious culinary posting in the American military, staffed by the best cooks the Navy could find, held to standards that made Michelin-starred restaurants look casual. "You were at the White House Mess?" "I was the head chef." Bill returned his attention to the plating. "4 administrations. Reagan's last year, all of Bush and Clinton, first year of W. I've cooked state dinners for kings. I've made midnight snacks for presidents who couldn't sleep. And I've fed Marines in forward positions with nothing but rice and whatever we could scrounge from the local economy." He handed a finished plate to one of the junior cooks, who rushed it out to the serving line. "After I retired from that, I moved into logistics. Figured I'd spent enough time making food. Might as well spend some time making sure it got where it needed to go. But cooking never leaves you. It's like a language you can't forget." Mitchell was silent for a long moment. Then she did something that made every cook in the kitchen stop and stare. She reached out and shook Bill's hand, Not the perfunctory handshake of a commander acknowledging a subordinate, but the genuine grip of someone expressing profound respect. "On behalf of this command," she said, "thank you. I don't know how to repay this." "Don't need repayment, ma'am. Just need people to eat. That's always been enough." The mess hall that night was the loudest it had been since the deployment began. Soldiers laughed. Soldiers talked. Soldiers went back for seconds, then thirds, scraping their plates clean and looking around for more. The food was gone within an hour, every pot emptied, every platter bare. Bill sat in the corner of the kitchen, finally eating his own portion, watching through the serving window as the soldiers he'd fed transformed from defeated to hopeful. This was why he'd never really retired. This was why he kept showing up at bases and outposts and places that maps forgot existed. Not because he couldn't stop working, but because he couldn't stop mattering. Colonel Mitchell found him there as the mess hall emptied. She sat down across from him, uninvited but not unwelcome. "I've served for 23 years, she said quietly. "I've seen a lot of things that military service can do for morale. Medals, promotions, visits from celebrities. None of them worked as well as what you did tonight with rice and canned beans." Bill scraped the last of his sauce with a piece of flatbread one of the cooks had improvised from flour and water. "Soldiers don't need celebrities, ma'am. They need to feel like someone's taking care of them. A good meal does that better than a handshake from someone famous. Always has. Always will." The supply truck finally arrived 4 days later, laden with turkey and stuffing and all the traditional fixings that had been promised. The mess staff prepared a second Thanksgiving dinner, technically on time according to military flexibility standards. It was good. Traditional. Exactly what everyone had been craving. But when soldiers talked about that deployment in the years afterward, they didn't talk about the turkey. They talked about the night old Bill Carver turned nothing into something, the night rice and beans became a feast, the night a logistics consultant revealed he'd once cooked for presidents and chose to cook for them instead. They talked about how food could be a language, how care could be an ingredient, how the best meal they'd ever eaten came from scraps that should have been thrown away.